From the moment the train rounded the bend, the crew sensed something was wrong. The night was unusually still, the kind of silence that made every shape on the tracks look suspicious. When the headlights swept forward, they revealed two figures lying across the rails. At first, the crew hesitated. They couldn't be sure what they were seeing. Maybe debris, maybe someone hurt, maybe some wild animals. But the shapes didn't move, not even when the horn blasted through the dark. When the engineer finally caught sight of what was up ahead, he pulled the emergency brakes anyway, knowing a freight train that size wouldn't stop in time. The wheels screamed, sparks scattered, and the cab filled with the awful understanding that they were headed toward a situation they couldn't change. In those seconds, the only thing the crew truly knew was that the boys weren't moving.
The police are not commenting on the incident at this time.
Fahmy Malak, as Arkansas State Medical Examiner, conducted the autopsies on the bodies of Kevin Ives and Doan Henry shortly after their discovery on the railroad tracks near Alexander on August 23, 1987, and determined that both deaths resulted from accidental causes tied to marijuana intoxication, emphasizing that the high levels of tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, in their systems, detected without other drugs present, were sufficient to induce this state of incapacitation, and he initially considered an apparent suicide classification before settling on accident based on the toxicology and scene evidence. He concluded that the boys had consumed the equivalent of approximately 20 marijuana cigarettes, leading to a deep stupor or psychedelic coma that caused them to lie motionless on the tracks, unaware of the approaching Union Pacific freight train's horn and vibrations, which ultimately ran over them while they remained unconscious. During a Saline County hearing in February 1988, Malak stood firmly by his judgment, dismissing alternative theories of foul play as unsupported by his examination. He maintained throughout that no external trauma preceded the train impact, viewing the boys' parallel positioning and lack of defensive movements as consistent with drug-induced immobility rather than placement by others. And he resisted releasing full samples for independent review, believing his procedures and findings were thorough and correct.
Read my lips. I'm not going to comment.
James H. Steed, Jr., as Saline County Sheriff in August 1987, overthrew the initial investigation into the deaths of Kevin Ives and Doan Henry following their discovery on the railroad tracks, and he claimed there was no evidence of foul play at the scene. In discussions with State Medical Examiner Fahmy Malak shortly after the autopsies, Steed suggested ruling the deaths accidental due to marijuana intoxication, believing this classification would be more acceptable to the families than suicide and aligned with the preliminary evidence of the boys' positions and toxicology results. Throughout early 1988, Steed repeatedly informed the Benton Courier that nothing observed at the tracks indicated anything beyond a strange accident, maintaining that the scene provided no basis for suspecting homicide and attributing public dissatisfaction to the understandable grief of the families, rather than any deficiencies in his office's handling. In February 1988, upon approach by the family's attorney, Steed agreed to initiate a comprehensive investigation and convene a grand jury, provided the parents withdrew their public criticisms of his administration and endorsed his re-election campaign. Following the grand jury's May 27, 1988, reclassification of the deaths as probable homicide, Steed declined to allocate county funds for further investigations into the later exposed drug trafficking links. The victim's attorney who approached Sheriff Steed in February 1988 to broker that controversial deal was Dan Harmon, the same man later appointed special prosecutor for the grand jury and elected Saline County prosecuting attorney in November 1988. Harmon, along with his deputy Richard Garrett, both appointed in April 1988 by Circuit Judge John Cole as special and deputy prosecutors for the Saline County Grand Jury investigating the deaths of Don Henry and Kevin Ives jointly, supervised the presentation of evidence and witness testimony, including the second autopsy findings, which documented a stab wound to Don Henry and blunt force skull fractures to Kevin Ives that occurred before the train impact. Under their leadership, the grand jury officially reclassified the deaths as probable homicide on May 27, 1988, and Harmon and Garrett continued to receive and review additional witness statements and physical evidence until the grand jury's adjournment without a final report on December 31, 1988. So here we have people who are high in power and involved in this case to a very extensive degree. From what I previously mentioned in the video, it all seems that they have done or did some significant part in this case, like ruling it from accidental causes to probable homicide. Then why is this video titled "Who Lied About the Two Boys on the Track?" Who are the liars? The answer: all of them. Let's begin with Fahmy Malak. Malak concealed a stab wound to Don's back and the blunt force trauma to Kevin's skull by ignoring these evident injuries during the autopsy, instructing his assistant to overlook them, and failing to perform confirmatory mass spectrometry testing for THC levels. He initially ruled the deaths as apparent suicide before altering the report to accidental THC intoxication a week after burial, using outdated crime lab letterhead to backdate and falsify findings just before court proceedings, thereby suppressing evidence of homicide. Malak withheld full autopsy files and tissue samples from independent review despite requests, motivated by political protection from Governor Bill Clinton, who had appointed him in 1979, repeatedly defended his erroneous rulings over 4 years of scandals, praised his work publicly, and proposed a 41.5% salary increase to $117,875 in 1989, amid calls for his removal, ensuring Malak's position shielded higher-level cover-ups in cases tied to Arkansas's corruption. James Steed concealed the inadequacy of the crime scene investigation by failing to secure the area with ropes or tape, allowing family members to later discover overlooked evidence, such as Kevin Ives's severed foot, parts of Don Henry's gun stock, and other personal belongings months after the initial search. He deceived the public and families by repeatedly assuring the Benton Courier that nothing at the tracks indicated foul play beyond a strange accident, despite train crew reports of a green tarp partially covering the bodies and audible gunshots, which he dismissed as an optical illusion without personal interviews or follow-up. Steed lied about sending the boys' clothing for forensic analysis to the FBI as required, instead routing it to the Arkansas State Crime Laboratory, which interrupted the evidence chain and delayed independent scrutiny. It was later discovered that Don Henry had taken his .22 rifle with him when he went hunting with Kevin on the night of the incident. He assured families that gunshot residue tests would be conducted on Don Henry's .22 rifle and that he would personally interview the train crew, but neither occurred, and he never requested assistance from the Arkansas State Police, despite promises. Steed also ignored an informant's tip on potential leads and allowed the train to depart without preserving the rear car as a reference or evidence collection. These concealments and deceptions arose from his effort to coordinate an acceptable death ruling with Malak, suggesting accidental marijuana intoxication over suicide to placate the families, while protecting his re-election amid Saline County's good all-boy corruption network, culminating in a February 1988 deal with attorney Dan Harmon, requiring the parents to cease public criticisms and endorse his campaign in exchange for reopening the probe, and later refusing county funds for drug trafficking inquiries after the grand jury's homicide determination, to avoid exposing local law enforcement's ties to smuggling operations. Harmon and Garrett further misled investigators by subverting the proceedings through selective evidence presentation and witness intimidation, as evidenced by Harmon's later federal conviction for racketeering tied to Saline County drug operations, ensuring the case remained unresolved. These actions stemmed from their deep entrenchment in the county's corruption network, where Harmon used his prosecutorial authority to protect participants in Minnell Inc., CIA drug smuggling, and local police complicity, viewing the grand jury as a controlled mechanism to shield higher-level officials and their own involvement in the drug scene from exposure. and by orchestrating a grand jury investigation that yielded no charges, despite polygraph-confirmed testimony implicating local law enforcement, they deceived the public and families by leading the Saline County grand jury to reclassify the deaths as probable homicide on May 27, 1988, while suppressing the 5-page jury summary recommending further probes into drug trafficking motives and police involvement, allowing Judge John Cole to withhold the report upon the panel's adjournment on December 31, 1988, and by dropping all subsequent charges against potential suspects like former deputies Jay Campbell and Kirk Lane. So what actually happened? Why are former deputies Jay Campbell and Kirk Lane potential suspects? What does this case, one that involves so many higher-ups, even Bill Clinton, have to do with drug smuggling? Before revealing all the connections, let's look at an incident that happened only 5 years ago, one that is tied deeply to the truth of this case. On November 13, 2020, a 72-year-old man and his brother-in-law went deer hunting on private land near Boxa in Saline County, Arkansas. Around 3:30 p.m., in thick woods, the brother-in-law fired a single shot, claiming he mistook the man in hunter orange clothing for game. The bullet struck him in the chest. He was airlifted to UAM's in Little Rock, but died shortly after arrival. The Saline County Sheriff's Office ruled it accidental within hours and filed no charges. This man was Stephen Schroyer, the Union Pacific locomotive engineer, who, at 4:25 a.m. on August 23, 1987, first spotted the bodies of Don Henry and Kevin Ives lying perfectly parallel on the tracks.
Poles away from it, my conductor yelled out, "Big hole." It looked like a body morgue. They were just laid out. And I got no reaction, none at all, not so much as a flinch. And we just passed over.
For 33 years, he was the most vocal of the 5-man crew, insisting the boys were already dead and deliberately placed there. By 2020, his 4 crewmates had all died of natural causes or unrelated accidents, leaving him the last living eyewitness. In the months before the hunt, he had agreed to his first new filmed interview in decades, scheduled for early 2021. His death became the latest in a decades-long string of violent or suspicious ends that claimed at least 7 witnesses and informants between 1988 and 1990. Keith Coney, who had been with Kevin Ives and Don Henry shortly before their murders in 1987, and who claimed 2 family members and friends that 2 law enforcement officers were responsible for killing the boys, was found dead on May 17, 1988, after his motorcycle crashed into a tractor-trailer during a high-speed chase by an unidentified vehicle that purportedly ran him off the road, with his throat slashed by attackers. Keith McCaskill, who was present at the railroad tracks on the night of the murders and who turned over information about the killings to prosecutor Richard Garrett just days before, realizing he had confided in the wrong person, was stabbed 113 times in a revenge killing on November 10, 1988. Greg Collins, subpoenaed to testify before the Saline County grand jury about the boys' deaths and questioned by Dan Harmon and Richard Garrett shortly prior, was killed on January 22, 1989, by 3 shotgun blasts to the face and chest in a wooded area near Prescott, Arkansas. Daniel Bearden, a friend of both Coney and Collins who had been subpoenaed to appear before the grand jury and who was rumored to know details of the events at the tracks, disappeared without trace in March 1989, with only an article of his clothing found at a site indicated by an anonymous caller claiming knowledge of his murder. Jeff Rhodes, who confided to his family that he knew too much about the murders of Ives Henry and McCaskill and expressed fear for his life, was shot in the head, decapitated, and burned in a landfill dump on April 3, 1989, after his motorcycle was found abandoned on the roadside as if he had stopped for someone. And that's not all. 3 other witnesses were all shot to death. In total, 9 witnesses connected to this case, each holding key clues that could have solved the mystery, are now dead. That is very hard to accept as a coincidence. Now that the people involved in their actions are fully clear, this is the moment when all the pieces finally begin to connect. It's time to put every dot together and trace the chain of events that led to the deaths of the two boys on the tracks. How the case shifted from an accident to a possible homicide. Why witnesses kept turning up dead or silent. And how a small-town tragedy became entangled with powerful political figures, including a future president. This is where the bigger picture starts to reveal itself. From the early 1980s through at least 1987, the CIA deliberately used the remote Mena Intermountain Municipal Airport and surrounding Arkansas drop zones to import hundreds of tons of Colombian cocaine because the Reagan-Bush administration faced a legal prohibition from Congress against directly funding the Nicaraguan Contra rebels with taxpayer money. The agency therefore turned to an off-the-books solution in which CIA contracted pilots, led by Barry Seal, flew cocaine into the United States, sold it through protected distribution networks, and funneled the resulting cash profits back to the Contras for weapons and supplies, an operation that generated an estimated $50 to $100 million annually, while simultaneously flooding American streets with drugs. Mena was chosen for its isolation, 3-mile runway, lack of radar coverage, and political protection from the Arkansas state government, allowing nightly parachute drops of cocaine bundles to rural sites, including the wooded clearing near Alexander and Bryant in Saline County, where ground crews retrieved the cargo under cover of darkness. On the night of Saturday, August 22, 1987, Don Henry and Kevin Ives left Bryant around 11:30 p.m. in Kevin's black Ford pickup to go spotlight hunting along the tracks, an activity they had done dozens of times. Multiple witnesses later placed low-flying aircraft and vehicles with flashing lights in that exact clearing between midnight and 2 a.m., consistent with the scheduled drop. The prevailing theory, supported by grand jury testimony, Charlene Wilson's statements, and polygraphed informants, holds that the boys parked near the tracks, walked into the drop zone with their .22 rifle and spotlight, and were confronted by the ground crew retrieving the parachute bundles, two of whom were later identified by eyewitness Ronnie Godwin and others as off-duty Pulaski County deputies Jay Campbell and Kirk Lane, both heavily involved in local narcotics enforcement and repeatedly named in sealed grand jury files as the uniformed men seen unloading cargo that night. Mistaken for rival traffickers or law enforcement, the boys were interrogated, beaten, and killed. Kevin's skull crushed with his own rifle butt, and Doan stabbed in the back, and then deliberately laid parallel across the rails, arms at sides, feet together, partially covered with the green military tarp that had secured the cargo, creating the appearance of two teenagers who had simply passed out. At 4:25 a.m. on August 23rd, Union Pacific engineer Stephen Schroyer's train rounded the curve, spotted the bodies, sounded the horn repeatedly, applied emergency brakes, but still ran over them, dragging the remains nearly a mile. From that moment, the cover-up began. Saline County Sheriff James Steed and State Medical Examiner Fahmy Malek, appointed and repeatedly defended by Governor Bill Clinton, immediately ruled the deaths accidental marijuana overdose equivalent to 20 joints, claiming THC-induced stupor, despite no confirmatory testing and visible pre-impact wounds. Clothing was misrouted. The rifle never tested for residue, the scene left unsecured, and the tarp dismissed as an optical illusion. When families forced a second autopsy revealing homicide, Malek's ruling was overturned, but the ensuing grand jury, controlled by prosecutor Dan Harmon, was sabotaged from within. Witnesses were intimidated, killed, leads buried. The Mena Salient pipeline itself, though heavily documented in later IRS, DEA, and Arkansas State Police files, was never federally prosecuted, with the CIA's own 1996 to 1998 internal reviews admitting aviation support at Mena while denying anything illegal. The archived consensus, therefore, remains that the boys were killed because they accidentally walked into an active CIA-protected cocaine drop, whose profits were secretly funding the illegal Contra War, and the subsequent 3 decades cover-up from Malek's falsified autopsy to Harmon's corrupted grand jury was orchestrated to protect the lingering political and intelligence liabilities of that operation. Kevin Ives and Don Henry were 17 and 16 years old. They were not collateral damage in some grand geopolitical game. They were 2 kids hunting deer who walked into the wrong field on the wrong night. The powerful men who protected the pipeline, the ones who falsified reports, intimidated jurors, and looked the other way when people started dying, all moved on, some to higher office, some to prison, some to the grave with their secrets intact. The boys did not get to move on. Their mothers never got to see justice, and that, more than any conspiracy theory, is the real crime that still lies on those tracks.